The music academy was buzzing with excitement that morning. It was the start of a new term, and everyone seemed eager to show off their talent. The halls echoed with the sound of instruments, pianos, violins, flutes, and guitars, each voice trying to be heard above the other. In one corner, students laughed loudly as they compared their new sheet music. In another, someone was already practicing for the upcoming inter-academy performance that everyone was talking about. Among all the confident faces and polished instruments, one person stood out, not because of what she did, but because of what she didn't do. She entered quietly through the side door, holding an old violin case that looked like it had seen better days. Her hair was tied back simply, and her shoes looked worn from long walks. No one recognized her, and her shy expression made it clear she didn't know anyone there either. A few students noticed her as she walked toward the registration desk. They exchanged quick glances and small laughs, whispering things under their breath. "Who brings a violin like that to this place?" one of them said softly. Another added, "Maybe she's just here by mistake." They didn't mean to be cruel. It was just the kind of careless talk that came from people too used to their own comfort. She ignored the whispers and signed her name on the form. Her handwriting was neat and careful, the kind of writing that belonged to someone who didn't rush through life. When the lady at the desk handed her a schedule, she thanked her politely and moved toward the hallway where the practice rooms were. Meanwhile, in the main studio, the Academy's star student was sitting at the grand piano. His name was known all over the place. He had won national competitions, given public performances, and even appeared in a small television feature about young musicians. People admired him not only for his talent, but also for the confidence he carried everywhere. He played with ease, never missing a note, his fingers moving as if the keys were made just for him. He was surrounded by other students who always seemed eager to impress him or get his attention. When the sound of a creaking violin case caught his ear, he glanced toward the door. The girl with the old case had just entered the studio. She stood there for a moment, looking around uncertainly, as if she wasn't sure if she was in the right room. He frowned slightly. Something about her didn't fit. The students here usually dressed neatly, carried shiny new instruments, and spoke the same way, polished and confident. But she looked out of place, as if she had stepped into a world that wasn't meant for her. Still, she found a spot in the corner and sat down quietly. She didn't open her violin yet. Instead, she listened as the others played. The piano filled the room with fast, impressive runs. A group of violinists practiced scales that sounded sharp and mechanical. The air was filled with competition rather than music. The young pianist finished his piece and looked up, his usual charming smile spreading across his face as everyone clapped. Then he noticed her again, the quiet girl in the corner. She hadn't clapped. She was just watching him with a calm expression, not cold, not admiring, just observing, as if she was studying every sound he made. It bothered him for reasons he couldn't explain. The instructor entered and announced the upcoming group assignments for the performance. Each student would have a chance to show their skills, either solo or in collaboration. The pianist was, of course, one of the top picks for a featured performance. When the teacher asked for new volunteers, a few hands went up. Then, to everyone's surprise, the quiet girl raised her hand too. There was a short silence, followed by a few muffled laughs. Even the teacher seemed taken aback for a moment. "You're new here, right?" he asked kindly. "Yes," she replied softly. "And you'd like to participate in the inter-academy performance?" She nodded. The teacher gave a polite smile. "All right. We'll see what you can do during the auditions next week." As she lowered her hand, she could feel the stares from the others. Some looked amused, others curious. The pianist smirked slightly, tapping his fingers on the piano lid. "Well," he said, half joking, "I hope she can keep up." The teacher gave him a warning glance, but the girl didn't react. She simply looked down at her violin case as if his words didn't matter. Still, deep inside, she felt something stir, a quiet determination that she hadn't felt in a long time. After the session ended, most students stayed behind to chat and laugh. She waited until the room was almost empty before opening her violin case. The violin inside wasn't new. The wood was scratched in places and the strings looked slightly worn. But when she lifted it out, she held it with care, as if it was something precious. She tightened the bow slowly, tuned the strings by ear, and began to play. The sound was soft at first, barely a whisper, but as the melody unfolded, It filled the room with something warm and real. It wasn't perfect, her timing wavered slightly in a few spots, but there was emotion in every note. The tune spoke of longing, of memories that couldn't be put into words. She didn't know the pianist was still there, standing near the door, listening. He hadn't meant to stay, but something about her sound caught him off guard. He leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying not to look too interested. Yet as she played, he felt something strange, a small crack in the wall of pride he always carried. When she finished, she sighed softly, wiped the strings with a cloth, and put the violin away. Only then did she notice him standing there. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then he said with a slight smile, "Not bad." She looked at him quietly. "Thank you." "You should work on your tuning, though," he added, as if trying to reassert his authority. "The academy has high standards." She gave a small nod and replied, "I'll keep that in mind." He expected her to be flustered or nervous, but her calmness unsettled him more. As he walked out, he found himself thinking about her tone, the way it trembled slightly, not from fear but from feeling. He couldn't explain why it stayed in his head long after he left. That night, while practicing alone in his apartment, he kept remembering that melody. His own playing was perfect as always, but somehow it felt empty. Every note sounded technical, not alive. For the first time, he wondered if maybe he'd been focusing on the wrong thing all along. The next few days at the academy went on as usual. The others talked about outfits, judges, and who might win the top spot. The quiet girl stayed in the background, practicing alone, never trying to draw attention. Sometimes he would pass by her practice room and hear her playing. He never went inside, but he always stopped for a few seconds to listen. He noticed how her music changed each day, growing stronger, more confident, more honest. There was something about it that couldn't be taught in a classroom. She wasn't chasing perfection. She was chasing truth. One afternoon, the teacher gathered everyone for a group practice session. "We're doing a few test duets today," he said. "I'll pair you up randomly." When the names were read out, the room filled with chatter. But when the teacher called the pianist's name and then hers, the room went silent. Even the teacher looked slightly amused. "This should be interesting," he said. "Let's see what happens." The pianist looked at her, a hint of a grin playing on his face. "Ready?" he asked. She nodded. They sat down, he at the piano, she with her violin. The teacher gave them a short piece to perform together. As soon as they began, it became clear their styles were completely different. He played fast, confident, showing off every run and flourish. She followed carefully, trying to match his rhythm. But something felt off. The melody lost its warmth under his heavy touch. Halfway through, she stopped playing. Everyone turned to look at her. The pianist frowned. "Why did you stop?" She looked at him and said quietly, "You're playing too fast." The room froze. No one had ever corrected him before, not in public. A few students exchanged glances, waiting for him to react. He gave a small laugh, though his pride stung. "Oh, really? Then you show me the right tempo." She met his eyes calmly. "All right." She lifted her bow again, took a deep breath, and started from the beginning. This time she played slower, every note deliberate, breathing, alive. It wasn't about showing off anymore. It was about telling a story. Her bow moved gently, her tone clear and full of emotion. Slowly, the pianist began to follow her lead. His hands softened, matching her pace. The room filled with something beautiful, something no one expected. When the piece ended, there was silence. The teacher smiled faintly, clearly impressed. The pianist looked at her, speechless. He felt a strange tremor in his chest, the kind that comes when pride meets truth. For the first time in a long while, he didn't know what to say. She quietly lowered her violin, gave a small nod, and walked out of the room. The others began whispering again, this time not with laughter, but with curiosity. The pianist stayed seated, staring at the keys, realizing that she had just changed something inside him, something he couldn't quite name yet. As she stepped outside, the cool air brushed against her face. She smiled softly to herself. She didn't need applause or approval. All she needed was to keep playing honestly, the way her father had taught her. Inside, he was still sitting at the piano, his hands resting on the keys, hearing her tone echoing in his mind. He had thought she was just another beginner. But now her music wouldn't leave him alone, and though he didn't know it yet, that single moment The quiet correction, the trembling note, was the beginning of everything that would come next. The next morning, the music academy was as busy as ever, but something felt different. People were still talking about what had happened the day before. The moment the quiet girl had stopped playing and calmly told the top pianist that he was going too fast. No one could believe it. The one person everyone admired, the one who never got corrected by anyone, had been told to slow down. The story spread through the halls like a gentle whisper. Some students laughed, thinking she had just been lucky. Others secretly admired her courage. But no one could deny that when she played, something powerful had filled that room. The pianist arrived a little later that morning. He was used to people greeting him, but now the usual crowd of admirers seemed quieter around him. They tried not to bring up yesterday's rehearsal, though a few couldn't resist teasing him. "Hey, looks like someone finally challenged you," one of them said with a grin. He gave a short smile, pretending it didn't bother him. "It was just a practice," and he replied calmly. "Let's see what happens during the real performance," but deep down, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The way she played had left a mark he couldn't shake off. It wasn't just the music, it was the honesty in it. There was no showing off, no competition, no effort to be perfect. It was as if she had played straight from her heart, and for the first time he had felt what real emotion in music sounded like. That night, he hadn't slept much. He kept hearing her melody in his mind. When he tried to play his usual pieces, they felt flat, empty, like they had lost their meaning. Now, standing in the same studio, he noticed she was there again. She sat in the corner as usual, her violin resting on her lap. She wasn't talking to anyone, just quietly looking at her sheet music. Their teacher came in with a warm smile and announced, "Today we're working on duets again. Let's keep the same pairs from yesterday." A quiet murmur went through the room. Everyone knew what that meant. The pianist and the quiet girl would be performing together again. He turned toward her and said with a half smile, "Looks like we're partners again." She looked up, her eyes calm and kind. "I guess so," she said softly. They took their places, and this time he didn't rush to start. Instead, he waited for her to lift her bow first. When she did, the sound that came out was steady and full. He followed her lead, his fingers moving gently over the keys. It was strange for him at first, letting someone else control the tempo, but slowly, he found comfort in it. The music felt balanced, like a conversation instead of a performance. When they finished, the teacher clapped softly. "Much better," he said. "You two have real chemistry when you listen to each other." The pianist smiled slightly, though a part of him still struggled with the idea that he wasn't the one leading. As they packed their instruments, he turned to her. "You play differently from everyone else here," he said. She looked surprised. "Is that bad?" He shook his head. "No. It's just different. It feels real." She smiled a little. "Music should be real," she said quietly. "Otherwise, it's just noise." Her words stayed with him for the rest of the day. Later that evening, while most students were gone, he returned to the empty studio. The soft light from the ceiling made the piano keys glow faintly. He sat down and began to play slowly. Not the fast, complex pieces he was known for, but a simple melody. Something honest. As he played, he thought of her expression while performing, focused yet calm, as if every note was a part of her story. For the first time, he wasn't playing to impress anyone. He was playing to feel something real. When he finished, he looked up and was startled to see her standing by the door. She had been listening quietly. "You play beautifully when you're not trying so hard," she said softly. He smiled faintly. "So you were watching me." She walked closer, carrying her violin. "I was walking by and heard you. It sounded different today." He nodded slowly. "Maybe you're rubbing off on me." She laughed quietly, not the nervous kind, but one filled with warmth. "That's not a bad thing." They stood there in silence for a moment, both realizing that something had shifted between them. It wasn't competition anymore. It was connection. Over the next week, they practiced together often. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they didn't. Most of their communication happened through music. When one of them played, the other understood exactly what to do next. It was like they shared an unspoken language that only they could hear. She began to open up a little about her life. She told him she had never taken formal lessons before joining the academy. She had learned by listening, first to her father, who used to play music on the streets, and later by imitating songs she heard in public performances. He was surprised. "You never had a teacher?" She shook her head. "My father taught me everything I know. He said music doesn't belong to classrooms, it belongs to people who feel it." He thought about his own journey, years of lessons, competitions, strict judges, applause. And yet somehow she had learned to play with more emotion than most trained musicians he knew. When he asked what made her join the academy, she said simply, "I wanted to see if I could belong here." He looked at her quietly for a long moment and said, "You don't need to prove that to anyone." She smiled, but her eyes told him she wasn't sure she believed that yet. Their teacher began noticing their growing harmony and decided to make them the highlight of the upcoming performance. "You two will play the final duet," he announced. "It's a big responsibility, but I think you can handle it." The room filled with murmurs again. Some students were jealous, others curious. The pianist knew what everyone was thinking, that he was carrying her. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. If anything, she was the one who had changed the way he played. As the performance day drew closer, they practiced every afternoon. One evening, while rehearsing a difficult passage, she suddenly stopped. "Can we try that part again?" she asked. He smiled. "You're becoming the perfectionist now." She shook her head gently. "Not perfection, just honesty. It didn't feel right the first time." He nodded and started again. This time it clicked. Their music flowed naturally, as if it had been waiting all along to be played this way. When they finished, they sat quietly for a moment. The sun had set outside, painting the room in shades of orange and gold. He looked at her and said, "You know, when you first came here, I thought you wouldn't last a week." She smiled knowingly. "I could tell," he laughed softly. "I guess I was wrong." "Yes," she said gently. "You were." There was no arrogance in her tone, just quiet truth. And he didn't mind being wrong this time. As they packed up to leave, she hesitated near the door. "You play beautifully," she said, "but sometimes it sounds like you're fighting with yourself." He looked at her a little surprised. "Fighting?" She nodded. "You have so much control in your hands, but not enough in your heart. You should trust yourself more." Her words hit deeper than she probably realized. He had spent years chasing perfection, terrified of mistakes. No one had ever told him to feel more, only to play better. After she left, he sat at the piano again, her words echoing in his mind. "Trust yourself more." The next morning, something strange happened. When the students arrived for class, they found him already there, earlier than anyone else. He was sitting at the piano, eyes closed, playing the same melody over and over, trying to understand it rather than control it. When she walked in, he looked up and smiled. "You were right," he said simply. "It's not about control." She didn't say anything, just smiled back and took her seat. From that day on, their rehearsals changed. They laughed more, argued sometimes about tiny details, and spent hours working on the smallest emotional moments in their music. The teacher often watched them with quiet pride, knowing something special was happening between them, not just as performers, but as people. The night before the performance, they stayed late at the academy. The lights were dim and the hall was quiet except for their music. When they finished the final run-through, they sat there, both tired and happy. He looked at her and said softly, "Tomorrow, when we're on that stage, just play the way you always do. Don't think about the judges or the audience. Just play for yourself." She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Only if you promise to do the same." "I promise," he said. They smiled at each other, and for a long time neither spoke. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken respect. When she finally left, he stayed behind for a few minutes, staring at the empty stage. He realized how much he had changed in just a few weeks. The pride, the need to be the best, it all felt smaller now. What mattered more was the connection they had found through music. As he walked out into the cool night air, he saw her standing near the gate, looking up at the stars. For a moment, he considered calling out to her, but he didn't. Some things were better left in silence. She turned slightly, noticed him, and smiled. "See you tomorrow," she said. "See you," he replied. Neither of them knew exactly what tomorrow would bring, but both felt something stirring deep inside, a quiet, growing belief that the music they would play together might change everything. And somewhere in his heart, He knew one thing for sure: she was no amateur. She never had been. She was the kind of musician who reminded people why they fell in love with music in the first place. The morning of the big performance arrived with a mix of excitement and nervous energy in the air. The Music Academy looked different that day. Polished floors, bright lights, and banners hanging in the main hall. Students rushed around carrying their instruments, fixing their outfits, and whispering last-minute reminders to themselves. The scent of polished wood and freshly printed programs filled the air. For weeks, everyone had been preparing for this moment. The Inter-Academy concert was not just another event, it was the biggest showcase of the year. Talented students from different schools were coming to perform, and a few well-known music critics were expected in the audience. It was a chance to be noticed, to be remembered. The pianist arrived early. For once, he didn't come with the usual confident smile that everyone expected. He walked straight to the stage carrying a simple bag with his sheet music inside. He sat at the grand piano and ran his fingers lightly over the keys, not to show off this time, but to calm himself. He had been through dozens of performances before, but today felt different. He wasn't worried about being perfect. He just didn't want to lose the feeling he and his partner had found together in their music. A few minutes later, she entered the hall quietly, just like always. She wore a simple pale dress and held her old violin case close to her chest. Her shoes made no sound as she crossed the wooden floor. When she saw him sitting at the piano, she gave him a small smile. "You're early," she said softly. He smiled back. "Couldn't sleep." "Me neither," she admitted. "It's strange. I've never played in front of a crowd like this before." He looked at her for a moment. "You'll be fine," he said. "You don't need to think about them. Just play for yourself like you always do." She nodded slowly, but her hands were trembling slightly as she opened her violin case. He noticed and, without saying anything, began playing a few soft notes on the piano, just random comforting sounds. She looked up, listened for a moment, and smiled. The music seemed to steady her. Soon the other performers began arriving, and the rehearsal space filled with noise again. Everyone looked nervous and excited. A few of them whispered when they saw the two of them together. Some still couldn't understand why the Academy's best pianist had agreed to perform with someone who was so new, so unknown. But he didn't care anymore. For the first time, their opinions didn't matter. The teacher came in, clapping his hands to get everyone's attention. "All right, everyone, listen up," he said. "We'll do one quick sound check and then take a short break before the show starts. Remember, this is not about showing off, it's about sharing music. Play from your heart." The pianist looked at his partner and smiled at that line. "Sounds like something you'd say," he whispered. She laughed softly. "Maybe he's learning from me now." When their turn came to check their instruments, they played just a few bars together. The sound echoed beautifully through the hall, soft but rich, like a quiet conversation between two souls. Even the stage workers paused for a moment to listen. The teacher nodded approvingly and said, "That's exactly the kind of connection we want tonight." After rehearsal, they sat outside in the courtyard, where sunlight filtered through tall trees. The audience hadn't started arriving yet, and the Academy grounds felt peaceful. She took a deep breath. "You know," she said slowly, "I used to play in the streets with my father. We never had a big audience, but sometimes a few people would stop and listen. I always thought the best music was played for strangers who didn't expect it." He looked at her, curious. "What do you mean?" She smiled faintly. "When people stop because they feel something, not because they're supposed to clap or judge you, that's when music is real." He nodded thoughtfully. "Then tonight, let's play for those people, the ones who came to feel something." She looked at him, and in her eyes was a quiet trust that neither of them had to explain. As evening came, the crowd began filling the hall. The lights dimmed slightly, and the sound of hushed voices spread through the air. Performers waited backstage, adjusting their instruments and whispering final words of encouragement. The pianist and the girl stood side by side near the curtains, listening to the sounds of the first few performances. Violins, cellos, and pianos filled the stage one after another. Some pieces were technically perfect, others emotional, but most felt rehearsed, beautiful yet predictable. When the announcer finally called their names, a hush fell over the audience. People leaned forward, curious. The pianist walked confidently toward the piano while she followed quietly, holding her violin close. They bowed together, then took their places. The pianist looked at her once before starting. He nodded slightly, a silent promise that he would follow her lead. She nodded back, took a deep breath, and lifted her bow. The first note that came from her violin was soft but full of life. It floated through the hall like a whisper, pulling everyone's attention toward her. Then the piano joined, gentle at first, then growing in harmony with her melody. The music built slowly, layer by layer. Her bow moved gracefully, her face calm but full of feeling. Every note she played seemed to carry a story of loss, hope, and quiet strength. The pianist followed every shift, every pause, matching her tone perfectly. Halfway through the piece, something magical happened. The audience disappeared. There was no stage, no lights, just music. The connection between them was so strong that even the smallest glance or breath carried meaning. The pianist felt his chest tighten as she reached a high, trembling note that filled the hall. For a moment, he forgot to breathe. Her sound wasn't loud or dramatic, it was honest. It carried everything she had ever felt. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was almost sacred. No one moved. Then slowly, the audience began to clap. The sound grew louder, then rose to a standing ovation. People cheered, some even wiping away tears. She lowered her violin, her hands shaking slightly. He looked at her and smiled, his eyes soft with gratitude. "You did it," he whispered. She shook her head. "We did it." As they bowed together, the applause washed over them like a wave. For once, neither of them felt like performers. They just felt like two people who had shared something real with the world. When they stepped backstage, the teacher was waiting for them, his eyes shining with pride. "That," he said quietly, "is what music is supposed to be." The pianist laughed softly, still catching his breath. "You were amazing," he said to her. She smiled. "So were you." "You listened," he chuckled. "I learned from the best." As the night went on, people kept coming up to congratulate them. Some students who had laughed at her before now looked at her with admiration. A few asked where she had trained, and when she said she had mostly taught herself, they were stunned. By the time the event ended, everyone was talking about their duet. But the girl didn't seem caught up in the excitement. She sat quietly at the edge of the stage, looking at her old violin with a thoughtful expression. He walked over and sat beside her. "You're not celebrating?" She shook her head gently. "I'm happy, but it feels strange. My father always said that real music doesn't need applause. It just needs to be felt. I think tonight he would have been proud." He looked at her and said softly, "He would have been very proud." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the crowd faded, replaced by the quiet hum of the empty hall. Then she said, "You know, when I first came here, I thought I didn't belong. Everyone looked so perfect. I was afraid someone would tell me to leave." He turned to her. "You belong here more than anyone. You reminded me what this is all about." She smiled, though her eyes were a little wet. "You've changed too," she said. "You play differently now." He laughed quietly. "Maybe I finally started listening to music and to people." They sat together for a while longer, talking softly about small things, the next piece they wanted to learn, the places they wanted to play someday, the kind of musicians they wanted to become. There was no talk of fame or awards, only of music and meaning. When they finally left the hall, the night air was cool and calm. The city lights shimmered in the distance, and the streets were almost empty. They walked side by side toward the gate in comfortable silence. Before parting, he looked at her and said, "Thank you for everything." "You changed the way I see music," she smiled gently. "You changed the way I see people." He watched her walk away, the violin case swinging lightly by her side. The sound of her footsteps faded into the quiet night. As he stood there alone, he realized something had shifted deep inside him. For years, he had chased perfection, applause, recognition. But now, all he wanted was to feel that same honesty every time he touched the piano. Her opening note that night hadn't just silenced the crowd. It had changed him completely. He took one last look at the empty street, then turned back toward the academy, his heart lighter than it had been in years. He knew this was only the beginning of something much bigger than a performance. It was the beginning of truly understanding what music and connection really mean. He waited until everyone had left the hall. The echoes of violin notes still floated in the air, faint and trembling as if they didn't want to leave. Adrian stood by the piano, pretending to pack his sheet music, but his eyes were fixed on her. She had already placed her violin back in its case and quietly walked out through the side door. He hesitated for a few seconds, then followed. Outside, the evening was calm. The last bit of sunlight stretched across the academy courtyard, turning everything gold and soft. The air smelled of rain that hadn't fallen yet. She was sitting alone on a wooden bench under an old tree, her violin resting on her lap. Her fingers gently traced the handle of the bow, not playing, just feeling. Adrian approached slowly, unsure of what to say. For someone used to commanding every stage, it was strange to feel nervous now. He cleared his throat lightly. "Hey," he said. She turned, a little startled, then smiled faintly. "Oh, hi." He sat down beside her, leaving a polite distance. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the city, distant cars, a bird calling from the roof, filled the silence between them. Finally, Adrian said, "You play." "Differently." She looked at him, a little confused. "Differently," he nodded. "Not like the others. Not like anyone I've heard here." She smiled again, softer this time. "Maybe because I didn't learn like the others." Adrian leaned forward slightly. "Where did you learn?" There was a small pause before she answered. "On the streets," she said quietly. "With my father." He didn't know what to say. The words felt too heavy, too real. He waited for her to continue. "My father used to play the violin outside the train station," she said, her eyes drifting to the sky. "We didn't have much, but people passing by would drop coins or sometimes a piece of bread. When I was little, I'd sit next to him and watch. He told me that music was our only roof. It kept the rain away, or at least in our hearts." Her voice was calm, almost steady, but there was something in her tone that made Adrian's chest tighten. She wasn't trying to sound tragic. She was just telling the truth. "When I turned 9, she continued, "he put the violin in my hands. It was too big for me back then, and I could barely hold the bow straight. But he told me, 'Don't think about playing notes. Think about what you want to say without words.' I didn't understand it then, but now I do." She smiled faintly, as if remembering something distant but warm. "We used to play together every evening until the police started pushing street musicians away. My father fell sick after that. He said the quiet was harder to bear than hunger." Her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't stop. "He passed away 2 winters ago. I sold his old coat to buy strings for the violin." Adrian's throat felt dry. He looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that the strength in her music wasn't born from training or fame. It came from survival, from loss, from love that had no stage or audience. He asked softly, "And you never studied music formally?" She shook her head. "No, I couldn't afford classes. But sometimes I stood outside the academy and listened through the doors. I learned the notes by ear. I would go home and try to play what I remembered." She looked down at her hands. "Most of the time it was wrong. But eventually I started getting it right." For the first time, Adrian didn't feel like the talented one. He'd spent his life surrounded by teachers, judges, and applause. Yet he had never worked for music the way she did. He said quietly, "You know, I used to think technique was everything. The precision, the control, the flawless timing." He gave a small laugh. "But when you played today, it felt like every note had a heartbeat. Like it was alive." She looked at him and smiled softly. "Maybe because I don't play to impress. I play to remember." The words struck him deeper than he expected. He nodded slowly, then leaned back against the bench, staring at the fading light. For a while, they didn't speak. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was peaceful. Two people from different worlds sitting in silence that said more than words could. After a few minutes, she opened her violin case again and pulled the instrument out carefully. "Would you like to hear something?" she asked. Adrian nodded. She positioned the violin under her chin, closed her eyes, and began to play. The sound was soft at first, almost like a whisper. Then it grew, filling the empty courtyard with warmth and ache. The melody wasn't a song Adrian recognized. It wasn't classical or structured. It was raw and personal. When she finished, she said quietly, "My father wrote that one. He never had paper to write notes, so he made me remember it instead." Adrian swallowed hard. "It's beautiful," she smiled. "He used to say music doesn't belong to the rich or the trained. It belongs to anyone who listens with their heart." For a moment, Adrian thought about all the times he'd dismissed someone on stage, all the students he thought weren't good enough. It made him uncomfortable, realizing how many people he might have looked down on without even knowing their story. He asked gently, "Why did you come here?" "To this academy?" She hesitated. "Because I wanted to learn properly," she said. "I wanted to know what I've been missing. But sometimes when I see how everyone looks at me, I think maybe I don't belong here." He shook his head firmly. "No, you belong here more than most of them." She looked at him in surprise. "I mean it," he said. "You have something we've all lost, the reason we started playing in the first place." Her eyes softened. "Thank you," she whispered. The streetlights flickered on and the soft glow painted their faces in gold and silver. The day had turned into night, but neither of them wanted to leave. After a while, she stood up, gently closing her violin case. "I should go," she said. "It's a long walk back home." Adrian stood up too. "Let me drop you," she shook her head. "No, it's okay. I'm used to walking," but he could see she was tired. The straps of her violin case had left faint red marks on her shoulder. "At least let me walk you halfway," he insisted. She hesitated, then nodded. "All right." They walked down the quiet street together. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the faint smell of rain and blooming jasmine from the gardens nearby. Adrian noticed how she looked at everything. The lights, the windows, even the sound of footsteps on the pavement, as if each thing had music hidden inside it. "Do you always listen this way?" he asked suddenly. She turned to him. "What do you mean?" "You seem to hear things differently, like the world is singing to you." She laughed softly. "Maybe. My father said music never stops playing. We just forget how to listen." He smiled at that. "He sounds like a wise man." "He was," she said quietly. When they reached the corner where their paths separated, she stopped. "Thank you for walking with me," she said. Adrian nodded. "Thank you for playing today. You reminded me why I started." She smiled. "Then maybe we both learned something." He watched her walk away, her small figure disappearing into the dim light. For the first time in years, Adrian felt something shift inside him, a mix of humility and admiration. That night, he couldn't sleep. He sat by his piano for hours trying to play the same piece they had rehearsed earlier, but it sounded hollow. No matter how perfect his fingers moved, the notes didn't carry what hers did. He stopped playing and just sat there, thinking about her words. "I play to remember." The next morning, he arrived at the academy earlier than usual. He didn't know why, but he hoped to see her again before rehearsal. When she finally walked in, she looked surprised to find him already there. "You're early," she said with a smile. "So are you," he replied. They both laughed softly, and something about that laughter broke the invisible wall between them. That day, when they practiced together again, something was different. Adrian didn't try to control the rhythm or lead the piece. Instead, he followed her, let her sound guide his hands. And when the final note rang out, it was perfect. Not because it was flawless, but because it was true. The other students noticed it too. The room that once buzzed with competition now felt still, touched by something real. From that moment, Adrian knew he couldn't go back to the way things were. He had spent years chasing perfection. Now he wanted to chase feeling. As for her, she finally started to feel seen. Not for her clothes or background, but for her music. That evening, as they packed up, Adrian turned to her and said quietly, "You changed something in me." She looked at him with kind eyes. Maybe music was meant to do that all along. And for the first time in his life, Adrian realized that sometimes the greatest teachers don't come from grand stages or famous names. They come from quiet streets, from loss, from people who learn to turn pain into sound. The day of the inter-academy performance arrived like a wave of nerves and excitement. The auditorium was decorated with long red curtains, bright stage lights, and the faint smell of freshly polished wood. Everyone in the academy was talking about it for weeks. Who would perform, who would win, who might impress the judges. But behind all that noise, two people were quietly preparing for something far more personal. Adrian had barely slept the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard her music in his head. It wasn't the melody itself, it was the feeling of it, the kind that made your chest tighten without knowing why. He had performed on countless stages, but this one felt different. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about connection. When he walked into the backstage room, she was already there, tuning her violin. She looked calm, but he noticed the slight tremor in her fingers. You ready? He asked softly. She smiled faintly. I think so, you? Ask me after we're done, he said with a small grin. She laughed quietly, and for a moment the tension eased. Their names were written side by side on the performance list. When the other students saw it, the whispers started immediately. Why would Adrian perform with her? He's the top pianist here. Is this some kind of joke? Maybe he's just trying to show off again. Adrian heard them, but he didn't react. He used to care about what people said, but not today. He glanced at her, and she seemed completely focused on her violin, blocking out the noise. One of the judges, an older man with glasses, walked by and said, "Ah, an unusual pairing. Let's see how this goes." Adrian just nodded. "Yes, sir." When it was finally their turn, the backstage lights dimmed and they stood together in the narrow corridor that led to the stage. He could hear the crowds murmur, students, teachers, families, and visitors from other academies. The sound of clapping echoed as the previous performers walked off. She looked up at him and whispered, "Let's play like it's just us." He nodded. "Always." Then they stepped out. The stage was huge, brighter than it had ever felt before. The air was thick with expectation. Adrian sat down at the grand piano, its black surface shining under the lights. She stood beside him, her violin under her chin, bow poised but not yet touching the strings. The audience quieted. The judges lifted their pens, and then silence. The kind that holds its breath. Adrian looked at her, waiting for her nod. When it came, he pressed the first key. A soft, low note filled the hall, steady and warm. Then came her response, one single note from the violin, delicate but powerful. It was as if both sounds recognized each other after being apart for years. The piece they chose wasn't a well-known one. It was something they had worked on together, a simple melody that grew into something much bigger. It started quietly, like a conversation between two people meeting for the first time, shy and uncertain. Then it slowly deepened, as if they were telling each other secrets through sound. Adrian kept his eyes on her bow, following her rhythm instead of leading it. Every time she leaned into a note, he adjusted his touch, softer or slower, matching her tone. It wasn't about control anymore. It was about harmony. The audience could feel it, the emotion behind every sound. It wasn't the kind of performance that dazzled with speed or technique. It was the kind that made you feel. At one point, her bow slipped slightly, creating a rough sound, and Adrian immediately shifted his chords to blend it, turning the mistake into part of the music. She looked at him for a second, just one small glance, and he smiled. They kept playing as if nothing happened. That one glance said everything. "I trust you." When the music reached its middle section, the tone changed. It became intense, full of heartache and memory. Her violin cried, not in sadness, but in longing. Adrian could feel the emotion rising through the piano keys, his hands trembling slightly as he played. He thought about her father, about her story, about how she had played on the streets just to survive. And now here she was, not in rags, not ignored, but standing tall under the lights, commanding silence from a hall full of people who once looked down on her. Something inside him broke in the best possible way. His chest tightened, his throat burned, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't performing. He was feeling. As the final notes began, everything slowed down. The melody softened like the sound of goodbye. Her last few notes floated into the air, fragile and trembling, then faded into silence. For a moment, no one moved. It was as if time itself had stopped. Then came the applause. Not polite, not formal. It started slowly, then grew louder, spreading through the entire hall until everyone was on their feet. The judges put down their pens. Some people had tears in their eyes. Even the ones who doubted her were clapping the hardest. Adrian looked up at her. She was smiling, not proudly, not nervously, just peacefully, like someone who had finally been heard. When they walked off stage, the backstage corridor felt unreal. The sound of applause still echoed behind them. She looked at him, still catching her breath. "Did we really just do that?" He smiled. "Yes, and you were incredible." Her eyes softened. "So were you." For a long moment, they just stood there, both knowing something important had just happened, something that had nothing to do with winning. A few minutes later, the head of the academy called them to the side. "That was the most honest performance I've seen in years," he said. You reminded everyone why music exists. Adrian nodded respectfully, but he didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The truth was written all over their faces. Later that evening, as the results were being announced, neither of them seemed to care. They stood near the back of the hall, still talking quietly, while the crowd cheered for the winners. When the announcer finally called their names for the special Emotion in Performance award, they both looked at each other and laughed. "I didn't even know that award existed," she said. "Neither did I," he replied. "But it fits." After the ceremony ended, people surrounded them. Students who once ignored her were now complimenting her. Teachers were shaking Adrian's hand, saying they hadn't seen him play with such soul before. But Adrian noticed that while everyone was talking, she quietly stepped away toward the window. She looked outside at the night sky, her violin case in hand. He followed her, just like before. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "Yes, I just needed a moment. It's a lot to take in." He understood. "You deserve every bit of it," she smiled faintly. "You know, when I first came here, I was scared. I thought everyone would see me as someone who didn't belong. And I was right. But today, for the first time, I felt like I did," he said quietly. "You changed more than your place here. You changed the way people think." She looked down. "I didn't mean to change anything." "That's what makes it real," he said softly. They stood there for a while, listening to the muffled sound of laughter and chatter coming from the hall behind them. It was peaceful, the kind of quiet that carried meaning. After a long pause, she turned to him. "Thank you," she said. "For what?" "For believing in me." Adrian shook his head. "You didn't need me to believe in you. You just needed someone to listen." She looked at him, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The music they played earlier still lingered between them, unspoken but alive. Later, when the crowd began to leave, they stepped out into the night together. The air was cool and the streetlights shimmered on the wet pavement. Somewhere nearby, a street musician was playing a simple tune on a harmonica. They both stopped and listened. She smiled. "That sound, it reminds me of home." Adrian nodded. "Music has a way of finding us, no matter where we go." As they walked down the quiet street, she said, "Do you think we'll ever play like that again?" He looked at her. "I hope so. But even if we don't, that moment, what we did on that stage, that stays forever." She smiled softly. "Then maybe that's enough." He watched her as she walked ahead, the faint sound of her footsteps blending with the music from the street. And he realized something he hadn't before. Greatness isn't about skill or fame or applause. It's about truth. That night, as he sat at his piano at home, he didn't play anything complicated. Just a few quiet chords, the ones that reminded him of her melody. And in that stillness, he understood, music was never about perfection. It was about connection, and for the first time in his life, he felt truly alive. The weeks after their performance felt like a dream neither of them wanted to wake up from. People in the academy talked about it every day. Even those who hadn't been there watched the video recording that spread online. It wasn't a flashy performance, and it didn't have grand costumes or perfect stage lighting, but it had something rare. It had truth. Adrian and the girl who once sat alone at the back of the rehearsal room were suddenly being noticed by everyone. Students who used to walk past her without a glance were now asking for her advice. Teachers who once doubted her background were inviting her to master classes. It was strange and overwhelming for her, but she handled it the same way she did everything, quietly, with grace. Adrian watched the change from the side. He saw how she still came early to practice, how she still cleaned her violin strings carefully, how she never let attention change her. He respected that deeply. One afternoon, a few days after the performance, Adrian found her sitting on the same bench under the old tree near the courtyard. The violin case was next to her, and she was reading a small notebook filled with handwritten notes. He sat beside her. "You're always here," he said lightly. She smiled. "It's peaceful here. I can hear the wind better than the noise inside." He looked at her, amused. "Do you always listen to the wind?" She laughed softly. "It's a habit. My father used to say every sound teaches something." Adrian nodded, thoughtful. He was right. They sat in silence for a while. Then she looked at him and asked, "Do you think people will forget what we played?" He thought for a moment. "Maybe people forget fast, but what matters is that we won't forget. She smiled faintly, closing her notebook. You're right. Over the next few months, life began to change for both of them. She started receiving offers, not just from small schools, but from big music institutes in other cities. Some wanted her to perform. Others wanted her to study with scholarships. At first, she was hesitant. She wasn't sure she was ready to leave. When she told Adrian about it, he encouraged her. You should go, he said. You've earned this. The world needs to hear what you have. She looked unsure. What about you? He smiled. I'll still be here. Teaching, learning, maybe playing differently now. But you're meant to travel with your music. Her eyes softened. I don't want to forget where I started. You won't, he said. The music won't let you. The day she left, the whole academy gathered to wish her luck. Adrian helped her carry her violin case to the taxi waiting outside. The morning air was cool and the sky was gray, but there was a strange brightness in it, like the world itself was cheering for her. As she stepped into the car, she turned to him one last time. Thank you for seeing me, she said softly. He shook his head. Thank you for reminding me how to listen. She smiled, then the car drove away, leaving a soft trail of dust behind. Adrian stood there for a long time, watching until it disappeared from sight. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The academy went back to its usual rhythm, but something inside Adrian had changed completely. He still played piano, still taught his students, but now his lessons were different. He no longer shouted about timing or technique. He told them stories instead, stories about listening, about honesty and sound. Perfection is just a word, he would tell his students. But feeling, that's what makes music alive. Whenever someone played too stiffly, he'd stop them and ask, who are you playing for? The judges, the crowd, or yourself? Most students didn't know how to answer at first. But slowly, his way of teaching spread through the academy and the place began to sound different, warmer, more alive. Meanwhile, news about her kept coming in. She performed at festivals, sometimes in small towns, sometimes on big stages. Adrian watched clips of her performances online. Every time she still closed her eyes before she played, the same way she always had, as if remembering something before letting the first note fly. Years passed like that, quietly but steadily. One evening, 5 years later, Adrian received a letter in his mailbox. The handwriting was familiar. It was hers. He opened it quickly, his heart suddenly beating faster. The letter was simple. I've been invited to play at the International Music Festival in the capital. They asked me to perform a duet. I can't think of anyone else I'd rather share that stage with. Would you join me? He smiled as he read the words again and again. The festival was one of the biggest in the region, a stage where world-class musicians played. And she wanted him there. He wrote back a short reply. Yes. I wouldn't miss it for anything. When he arrived at the capital's grand concert hall weeks later, it felt like déjà vu. The stage lights, the polished floor, the hum of nervous energy. But this time, the person waiting for him wasn't a shy girl holding an old violin case. She was confident now, dressed simply but elegantly. Her presence calm and steady. Yet when she smiled, it was still the same kindness, the same quiet soul. You made it, she said. Of course, he replied. I couldn't let you have all the applause. She laughed softly, shaking her head. You never change. They practiced together for hours, slipping back into rhythm as if no time had passed. Every note felt natural, like their music had been waiting for this reunion. The night of the performance, the hall was packed. People from different countries sat waiting. The stage was wide, the lights golden, and the silence before they began felt heavier than ever. Adrian glanced at her before they started. Ready? She smiled. Always he pressed the first key. She lifted her bow. And just like years ago, their sounds met in the middle, piano and violin, perfectly balanced. It wasn't the same piece they had played in the academy, but it carried the same spirit. It told a story of where they began, of what they lost, and what they found again. Every note felt alive. The crowd leaned forward, drawn into something they couldn't quite describe. Adrian's hands moved gently, guiding the piano's tone to cradle her melody. Her violin answered him, rising and falling like breath itself. When the final note faded, the hall stayed silent for a heartbeat, then erupted into applause that seemed to shake the walls. They stood side by side, bowing deeply. And as the lights dimmed, Adrian whispered to her, "You've come a long way." She turned to him. "We both have." After the performance, they met backstage, still glowing with the rush of it all. Musicians and reporters crowded around, but for a few seconds, it felt like it was just the two of them again, like that first day she corrected his tempo in the rehearsal hall. She looked at him with grateful eyes. "You know," she said, "sometimes I still think about that day. The first time I played in front of everyone. I thought you were going to hate me." Adrian laughed softly. "I did for about 5 minutes." They both laughed, then she added, "But you listened anyway." "That changed everything for me." He nodded slowly. "And you changed everything for me." Over the next few years, they kept in touch, meeting at festivals and teaching workshops together. People admired their bond, not romantic, but something deeper, built on mutual respect and shared passion. They both became known not just for their skill, but for the way they spoke about music, as something human, something beyond fame. Eventually, Adrian opened his own music school. He called it the Listening House. His teaching philosophy was simple: feel before you play. On the school's opening day, she was there beside him, holding her violin as the first guest performer. When he introduced her to the crowd, his voice was warm and full of pride. "This is the person who reminded me what music really means," he said. "She taught me that the first note you play should come from your heart, not your head." She smiled shyly, then began to play. The melody was gentle and pure, one of her father's old tunes, the same one she had played for Adrian years ago under that tree. The crowd listened quietly, and Adrian stood behind her, his eyes misty, knowing that everything had come full circle. When she finished, there was silence again, that same golden silence that always followed her music. Adrian stepped forward, placed his hand on her shoulder, and whispered, "Your father would be proud." She looked up, smiling through tears. "I think he's listening." Years later, when people spoke about them, they didn't talk about trophies or records. They talked about the story of how one pianist and one unknown violinist changed each other's lives with a single song. And every time someone asked Adrian how it all began, he'd smile and say, "It started with a girl everyone thought was an amateur, and the note that made me tremble."